You assumed because I was new to this empire, I wouldn't know where the bodies were buried, Richard. Game over.
Sign this amendment and transfer exactly 50% of the board's voting rights to my name, or you can walk out to that altar and face the press alone. Evelyn Hayes stated, her voice devoid of any tremor, as she slid the heavy parchment across the mahogany vanity, while the most dangerous billionaire in Manhattan calmly adjusted the onyx cufflinks of his wedding tuxedo. The opulent bridal suite of St. Patrick's Cathedral was suffocatingly silent, heavy with the scent of white lilies and the palpable tension of a multi-billion-dollar empire hanging in the balance. Julian Sterling didn't flinch, his piercing green eyes locking onto hers in the gilded mirror before he slowly turned around, his imposing figure casting a cold, terrifying shadow over the brightly lit room. He had expected a terrified, weeping younger sister, Chloe, the original bride, who had buckled under the immense pressure of an arranged corporate marriage. But instead, he was facing Evelyn, the sharp, relentless retail executive who had stepped into the designer gown without shedding a single tear. You are vastly overestimating your leverage, Evelyn, he murmured, his voice a low, lethal purr that usually sent grown men scrambling for the door, as he stepped closer to the woman who was effectively blackmailing him on their wedding day. And you are vastly underestimating your current vulnerability, Julian, she countered immediately, standing her ground despite the sheer intimidating force of his physical proximity, refusing to let him see how fast her pulse was racing under the imported silk of her bodice. She knew exactly what was at stake. Stoic investing was hours away from finalizing a hostile takeover of the largest global supply chain network. A massive deal, contingent entirely upon Julian presenting a stable, scandal-free family image to the conservative European board members sitting in the pews outside. I don't want the $10 million payout you offered my father to save his sinking company, nor do I want the meaningless, pathetic title of a trophy wife. She continued, her gaze unwavering as she tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the signature line of the amended contract. I know about the liquidity loophole in your offshore holdings, the one your Uncle Richard has been quietly sniffing around to oust you from the CEO seat, which means you need this merger to cover the deficit immediately. So 50% of your voting power is the price of my silence and my compliance today, Julian, because I absolutely refuse to be another disposable pawn in your stoic little equations. A dangerous, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of Julian's mouth as he realized the woman standing before him was not a sacrificial lamb, but a predator who had carefully studied the complex architecture of his glass fortress. He had spent his entire life quantifying human emotions into predictable variables, stripping away his own vulnerabilities after a devastating family betrayal had taught him that trust was the ultimate liability. Yet Evelyn's sheer audacity was a chaotic anomaly he hadn't factored into his rigorous risk assessment. Giving you half my voting rights is tantamount to handing you the keys to my kingdom, a kingdom you have absolutely no idea how to rule, he stated coldly, picking up the gold-plated fountain pen from the desk and weighing it in his hand as if contemplating using it as a weapon rather than a negotiating tool. I don't need your permission to rule. I only need your signature to level the playing field. So you can never dispose of me the way you dispose of your failing assets. She shot back, her chin lifting in a defiant tilt that sent an involuntary, irritating jolt of raw attraction straight through his meticulously guarded chest. With a sharp exhale that sounded remarkably like a curse, Julian pressed the pen to the heavy paper and slashed his signature across the line, legally binding them together in a transactional nightmare. "You just bought yourself a brutal war, Mrs. Sterling," he whispered darkly, tossing the pen onto the desk before closing the final inch between them, his large hand wrapping firmly around her waist in a proprietary grip that made her breath hitch in her throat. "I've been fighting my whole life, Mr. Sterling. I assure you I rarely ever lose," she replied smoothly, forcing her rigid muscles to relax into his hold as the heavy oak doors of the suite swung open, signaling that it was finally time to step into the blinding, unforgiving spotlight. The transition was instantaneous and terrifyingly seamless. The cold, calculating adversaries vanished into thin air, replaced in a heartbeat by a picture-perfect Manhattan power couple, radiating an elaborate illusion of deep, untouchable devotion. As the majestic, sweeping chords of the wedding march echoed through the cavernous cathedral, Julian guided her down the long aisle, his thumb subtly stroking the bare skin of her back in a performative gesture of intimacy that sent genuine, confusing shivers down her spine. The pews were packed with the city's elite, a dangerous sea of calculating eyes and whispered gossip, all searching for a microscopic crack in the billionaire's armor. But Evelyn smiled radiantly, playing her part flawlessly while secretly plotting her next strategic move in the boardroom. The lavish reception at the Plaza Hotel was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare, brilliantly disguised beneath the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the fragrant bloom of thousands of imported white roses. Evelyn moved through the crowded ballroom with a predatory grace, charming the skeptical conservative European investors with her sharp intellect and flawless French, seamlessly securing the public relations victory Julian desperately needed to finalize his supply chain merger. Standing by a towering ice sculpture, Uncle Richard Sterling, a man whose jovial smile masked a ruthless, burning ambition to reclaim the company he felt was unjustly stolen from him, watched the newlyweds with narrow, assessing eyes. "I must admit, Julian, I expected Chloe's fragile, weeping demeanor, not this formidable creature who seems to know our profit margins better than our own accounting department," Richard remarked, his tone dripping with a faux, sickening affection as he approached them, holding his glass up in a mock salute. "Evelyn is full of brilliant surprises, Richard, which is precisely why she is the only woman on earth fit to stand by my side," Julian replied, without missing a single beat, pulling Evelyn flush against his chest and kissing the top of her head, a strategic display of unity that effectively silenced his uncle's probing questions, while masking the violent turf war raging beneath their tailored clothes. It wasn't until well past midnight, after the final flashbulb had popped and the obligatory exhausting pleasantries were concluded, that they finally escaped to the sterile, minimalist sanctuary of Julian's glass-walled penthouse overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. There was no romantic carrying over the threshold, no lingering glances of newlywed exhaustion. The exact moment the heavy security doors locked behind them, the stifling illusion of their perfect marriage evaporated into the chilled, climate-controlled air. Evelyn immediately kicked off her diamond-encrusted heels, groaning softly as she rubbed her aching arches, while Julian discarded his tuxedo jacket over a Barcelona chair, the sheer exhaustion of maintaining his stoic facade finally showing in the rigid, painful tension of his broad shoulders. Instead of leading her to the opulent master suite, he walked straight to the massive, custom-built boardroom table that dominated his home office, hitting a silver button that illuminated a complex array of financial dashboards on the wall monitors. The 50/50 clause is now officially active, which means tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, you will be briefed on the exact magnitude of the mess you just forced yourself into, he announced, his voice echoing coldly in the cavernous space as he poured himself a neat glass of expensive scotch. Evelyn didn't flinch at the sheer volume of intimidating financial data flashing rapidly across the screens. Instead, she walked barefoot across the cold hardwood floor, pouring herself a glass of ice water before taking a seat directly opposite him at the long table. I expect full security clearance to the executive floor, unrestricted access to the raw data files regarding the offshore accounts you're desperately hiding from Richard, and a dedicated team of senior analysts by noon. She outlined calmly, leaning back in her leather chair, with a commanding presence that made it entirely clear she wasn't asking for his permission. Julian stared at her over the rim of his crystal glass, a muscle feathering dangerously along his sharp jawline, as he realized this infuriating woman was genuinely prepared to dismantle his carefully structured corporate hierarchy from the inside out. He had spent years systematically isolating himself, operating on the absolute certainty that human connection was a fatal flaw that inevitably led to ruin. But sitting across from a wife who demanded raw power rather than affection was a dangerous, unpredictable new variable. You can have the access, Evelyn, but if you miscalculate and give Richard the ammunition he needs to trigger a board vote of no confidence, I will personally ensure you leave this marriage with absolutely nothing. He warned, setting his glass down with a definitive, ringing thud that punctuated his threat. If I miscalculate Julian, we both go down in flames, which means it's heavily in your best interest to start treating me as an equal partner rather than a hostile corporate acquisition. She fired back, her green eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising intelligence that he found incredibly, frustratingly alluring. She stood up gracefully, retrieving her discarded heels and her small overnight bag, her slender frame beautifully silhouetted against the breathtaking backdrop of the city lights, projecting a solitary strength that perfectly mirrored his own deeply ingrained isolation. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the heavy, impenetrable armor they both wore seemed to crack, leaving them entirely exposed in the quiet intimacy of the penthouse. Two ruthlessly ambitious people who had built walls so exceptionally high they had forgotten how to let anyone in. Julian's watched her walk confidently toward the guest wing, his mind involuntarily cataloging the graceful curve of her spine and the subtle, intoxicating scent of jasmine she left in her wake. A scent that threatened to unravel the absolute stoic detachment he prided himself on. The dark ink on their revised contract was barely dry, but the brutal war for control of stoic investing and the far more dangerous battle for the control of their own fiercely guarded hearts had officially, irreversibly begun. The massive frosted glass doors of the Stoic Investing executive boardroom swung open precisely at 8 o'clock the next morning, slicing through the tense, hushed murmurs of the assembled senior partners and European investors. Julian sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, a terrifying portrait of absolute control in a bespoke navy suit, projecting an aura of invulnerability that completely masked the sleepless night he had spent analyzing his new wife's demands. He was mid-sentence, outlining the aggressive restructuring protocols for the newly acquired supply chain network when Evelyn walked in, not taking the decorative chair reserved for spouses in the gallery, but striding directly toward the empty high-backed leather seat immediately to his right. She wore a tailored crimson sheath dress that commanded attention, her laptop and a thick stack of printed dossiers clutched in her hands like weapons of war. Forgive the slight delay, gentlemen, but I needed to verify a few distressing discrepancies in the Q3 logistics projections before casting my vote, she announced smoothly, her voice a melodic but authoritative chime that brought the entire room to a dead, shocked halt. Uncle Richard, sitting halfway down the table, let out a condescending chuckle, his eyes darting to Julian to see how the famously ruthless CEO would handle this blatant insubordination from his 24-hour bride. Evelyn, darling, this is a closed executive session for voting members only, Richard purred, leaning forward with a patronizing smile. Actually, Richard, as of 9 o'clock last night, I hold a legal proxy for exactly 50% of my husband's voting rights, making my presence here not only mandatory, but highly decisive, she countered brilliantly, dropping her dossiers onto the table with a sharp thud that echoed like a gunshot. The collective gasp from the senior partners was almost comical, a ripple of pure corporate terror sweeping through the room as dozens of eyes frantically ping-ponged between the unfazed Evelyn and the dangerously silent Julian. Julian's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his platinum pen, utterly furious that she had chosen a room full of sharks to test the limits of his authority and the lethal boundaries of their new contract. As I was saying before the interruption, we will proceed with the immediate liquidation of the Seattle distribution hubs, cutting the operational workforce by 40% to artificially inflate our short-term margins and appease the acquisition debt, Julian stated coldly, his piercing green eyes locked entirely on Evelyn, issuing a silent, terrifying warning to back down. Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her laptop and flawlessly projected a complex, color-coded logistical map onto the main screen behind him. I am formally using my 50% proxy to veto that liquidation, Julian, because gutting those specific Seattle hubs will entirely sever our direct access to the Asian import markets within 6 months, she declared, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Richard's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sudden, intense scrutiny as he realized this woman was actively dismantling a trap he had spent months carefully laying out for his nephew. You are overstepping your boundaries, Evelyn. Julian hissed, the lethal calmness in his voice, sending shivers down the spines of the European investors. I am protecting our assets from a glaring tactical error that would trigger a catastrophic stock plummet by next quarter, which means I am doing exactly what a 50% stakeholder is obligated to do, she fired back, meeting his icy glare with a blazing, unyielding fire that ignited the room. 5-minute recess. Julian commanded his voice, a low, vibrating growl that left absolutely no room for debate as he stood up, grabbing Evelyn's elbow in a vice-like grip and steering her forcefully out of the boardroom and into his adjacent private office. He slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them, plunging the room into a charged, suffocating silence before he rounded on her, his towering frame practically vibrating with suppressed rage. Are you actively trying to humiliate me in front of the very board members who are currently looking for an excuse to tear me apart? He demanded, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, his signature woodsy cologne wrapping around her senses like a snare. I am trying to stop you from walking blindly into a slaughterhouse, Julian, she yelled back, refusing to retreat a single inch, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs as she pointed a manicured finger at his chest. Richard deliberately manipulated those Q3 logistical projections to make the Seattle hubs look like dead weight, knowing full well that if you liquidate them, the Asian import revenue will collapse, triggering the exact liquidity crisis he needs to call a vote of no confidence. Julian froze, the raw anger draining from his face as his brilliant analytical mind rapidly processed the complex logistical data she had just presented, the pieces of his uncle's insidious puzzle violently clicking into place. He stared down at her flushed, defiant face, utterly blindsided not by a betrayal, but by the staggering realization that his fake wife had just saved his entire empire from a fatal, invisible sabotage. The heavy combative tension in the private office instantly mutated into something far more dangerous, a thick, suffocating wave of profound respect and an electric, undeniable sexual attraction that Julian had never permitted himself to feel in a professional setting. He looked at Evelyn as if seeing her for the very first time. She wasn't a corporate pawn or a desperate daughter clinging to a bailout. She was a fiercely intelligent predator who spoke his language and fought with a brutality that perfectly matched his own. You found a discrepancy in the supply chain data that my senior analysts missed for 3 months, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, losing its sharp edge as his gaze drifted involuntarily to the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. I grew up breathing retail logistics, Julian. While your analysts look at numbers on a spreadsheet, I look at the physical flow of goods, and Richard's plan halts the flow entirely, she explained, her voice softening slightly, acutely aware of how the sudden proximity was making her own meticulously guarded walls tremble. He slowly reached out his long fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the shockingly tender gesture sending a jolt of pure fire straight down her spine. You took a massive risk publicly vetoing me without warning Evelyn, he whispered, stepping even closer, the magnetic pull between them threatening to override every logical protocol he had ever written. I needed Richard to believe he had successfully cornered you so we could blindside him together with a united superior strategy, she replied, her breath catching as his thumb lightly traced the line of her jaw. Then let's go back out there and show my uncle exactly what 100% of our combined power looks like, he stated, a slow, predatory smile finally breaking across his face. When Julian and Evelyn re-entered the boardroom side by side, the atmospheric shift was so drastic it practically sucked the oxygen from the room. They no longer looked like adversaries engaged in a bitter power struggle, but a terrifying, synchronized force of nature. Julian calmly retook his seat, exuding a new, lethal confidence, while Evelyn stood by the projector, her posture perfectly aligned with his. After reviewing the supplementary data provided by my wife, I am officially withdrawing the motion to liquidate the Seattle hubs, Julian announced, his voice smooth and absolute, watching with dark satisfaction as the color instantly drained from Richard's face. Instead, we will be heavily reinvesting in the Asian import routes, utilizing a newly acquired retail network that Evelyn will be personally integrating into Stoic's operational framework. Richard sputtered, desperately shuffling his papers, trying to salvage his months of quiet sabotage. Julian, this is completely unorthodox. You cannot simply hand over operational oversight to someone who isn't even formally vetted by the board, Richard protested, his jovial mask slipping to reveal the venomous ambition beneath. Evelyn owns 50% of the voting power, Richard, which makes her vetting process infinitely superior to yours, Julian countered effortlessly, leaning back in his chair and casting a look of absolute, unwavering support toward his wife. The European investors, thoroughly impressed by Evelyn's flawless data presentation and Julian's swift, decisive adaptability, murmured their collective approval, effectively sealing the victory and crushing Richard's immediate hopes of a coup. As the boardroom cleared out, leaving behind a trail of hushed, awestruck gossip about the new Mrs. Sterling, Richard lingered in the corridor, pulling his closest corporate ally into the shadows near the elevator bank. She isn't just a desperate girl trying to pay off her father's debts. She knew exactly where to look for those buried logistical files. Richard hissed, his face contorted in a mask of paranoid fury as he watched Evelyn and Julian walk away, their shoulders brushing in a display of easy, terrifying intimacy. I want a complete, microscopic deep dive into Evelyn Hayes's past, her father's failing company, and every single connection she has ever had to the retail sector. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with the terrifying possibility that his nephew had accidentally married a woman far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Julian thinks he's immune to emotion, but I saw the way he looked at her in that room. She is his blind spot, and if we can figure out her true motive for infiltrating this company, we can detonate that 50-50 clause and destroy them both. Unaware of the target suddenly painted on her back, Evelyn walked alongside Julian toward the executive elevator, a strange, exhilarating adrenaline pumping through her veins. She had survived her first battle in his world, but as she glanced up at his handsome, stoic profile, she felt a sharp pang of guilt. She was fighting Richard to protect Julian today, but her ultimate secret goal of avenging her father's destroyed legacy was a ticking time bomb she was hiding directly under his nose. Late that evening, the sprawling penthouse was bathed in the soft blue glow of multiple computer monitors, the silence punctuated only by the rapid clicking of keyboards as Julian and Evelyn worked side by side at the massive home office table. The hostile territorial lines they had drawn the night before had completely vanished, replaced by a seamless, intoxicating collaboration that felt entirely foreign to them both. Julian found his eyes constantly wandering from the quarterly reports to watch Evelyn as she chewed on the cap of her pen, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as she cross-referenced the newly secured Seattle logistics. You need to shift the secondary distribution routes through Portland to avoid the new state tariffs, she murmured, leaning over his shoulder to point at a specific column on his screen. Her proximity sending a fresh, distracting wave of jasmine scent washing over him. You're right, the tariff margins would negate the Asian import profits by 10%, he agreed, turning his head slightly so that his lips were dangerously close to the soft curve of her neck. He paused, his hands freezing over the keyboard, utterly overwhelmed by the sudden irrational urge to abandon the spreadsheets entirely and pull her into his lap. Evelyn felt the shift in his breathing, the sudden heavy tension that made the air in the room crackle with suppressed electricity. She slowly turned her head, their faces mere inches apart, the sterile blue light of the monitors illuminating the undeniable, terrifying hunger burning in his deep green eyes. You are a very dangerous distraction, Evelyn, Julian whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate directly against her skin. His rigid philosophy of stoic detachment completely failing him in the face of her brilliant, fiery presence. I thought you didn't believe in distractions, Julian. I thought everything was just a predictable variable in a chaotic world, she replied breathlessly, her heart hammering as she found herself unconsciously leaning closer, trapped in the magnetic, hypnotic pull of his gaze. You are not a variable. You are an anomaly, and you are entirely dismantling my peace of mind, he confessed, raising his hand to gently trace the line of her collarbone, his touch igniting a trail of fire that made her gasp softly. She had built her entire life around the absolute necessity of maintaining control, of never letting a man dictate her worth or her power. Yet the way he looked at her, with a mixture of profound intellectual respect and raw, unadulterated desire, was systematically breaking down her defenses. They hovered on the precipice, the 50-50 war they had declared, suddenly feeling less like a corporate battle and more like a desperate, passionate struggle for the control of their own fiercely guarded hearts. But as the distant city lights flickered below their glass fortress, the dark secrets of Evelyn's past and Richard's impending investigation loomed silently in the shadows, threatening to tear apart the beautiful, terrifying connection they were just beginning to build. The deafening roar of the private jet's engines did little to drown out the absolute silence suffocating the cabin as Julian stared at the catastrophic numbers bleeding across his tablet. At 2 a.m., a massive localized system failure had completely paralyzed the Seattle distribution hubs, effectively halting millions of dollars in Asian import cargo and creating the exact liquidity crisis Richard had desperately wanted. Evelyn sat across from him, her bare feet tucked beneath her on the leather seat, rapidly typing complex override commands into her laptop as the storm raging outside battered the aircraft. "It's a deliberate, localized code corruption, Julian. Someone wiped the main routing manifests manually, and it requires executive-level clearance from the inside," she announced, her voice tight with exhaustion and the adrenaline of a midnight emergency flight. Julian's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek, the terrifying reality of a deeply embedded mole within stoic investing, fracturing his ironclad sense of control. Richard is accelerating his timeline, forcing an immediate operational collapse so the European board members panic and strip me of my CEO title by Friday, he stated coldly, staring out the window into the pitch-black sky. He had built his entire empire on the fundamental belief that he could control every variable. But sitting in the pressurized cabin with a wife who was fighting his wars, he felt an unfamiliar, terrifying sense of freefall. The moment the sleek black SUV pulled up to the sprawling, rain-slicked Seattle warehouse complex, Evelyn was completely in her element, stripping away the polished Manhattan executive persona to reveal the rugged, fiercely competent logistics expert beneath. She stepped out into the torrential Pacific Northwest downpour, wearing a borrowed trench coat over her simple travel clothes, immediately intercepting the panicked floor managers with a commanding, unshakable authority that made Julian pause in his tracks. "I want the secondary manual manifests printed and distributed to the loading bays right now, and reroute the priority cargo through the Portland bypass before the morning shift arrives," she ordered, pointing toward the massive loading docks while rainwater plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. Julian watched her orchestrate the chaotic, terrified workforce with a surgical precision, utterly captivated by the raw, unpolished strength of a woman who didn't just read spreadsheets, but actually commanded the physical beating heart of the industry. He was accustomed to corporate mercenaries who thrived in sterile boardrooms, but seeing Evelyn standing in the freezing rain, fighting tooth and nail to save an asset she technically only owned on paper, triggered a profound tectonic shift in his deeply guarded chest. For the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, Julian felt a sharp, undeniable surge of pure admiration and a fiercely protective possessiveness that completely defied the sterile terms of their 50-50 contract. It took them 6 grueling hours of wading through massive pallets and coordinating manual overrides to temporarily stabilize the bleeding supply chain, effectively patching the arterial wound Richard's saboteur had so maliciously inflicted. Back in the makeshift, fluorescent-lit site manager's office, Julian finally managed to trace the origin of the corrupted routing code, his green eyes darkening into a terrifying lethal storm as the IP address flashed on the screen. The breach didn't come from a mid-level manager. The override was executed using a phantom administrative account created within my own uncle's private server network. He whispered the sheer, devastating weight of the family betrayal, echoing in the small, cramped room. Evelyn looked up from her stacks of printed manifests, her heart aching as she witnessed the formidable, untouchable billionaire visibly fracture under the realization that his own blood was actively trying to destroy him. Julian, this proves Richard is legally culpable. We can use this data trace to expose him to the European investors and completely neutralize his vote of no confidence, she said softly, moving around the cheap metal desk to stand beside him. But Julian just stared blankly at the screen, the cold, stoic armor he wore to survive the world cracking wide open, revealing a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the people closest to him to stick a knife in his back. The torrential storm had escalated into a severe weather warning by the time they retreated to the only available suite at a discreet downtown Seattle hotel, forcing them into a dangerously intimate proximity, away from their usual Manhattan battlegrounds. The opulent room was heavy with the scent of damp wool and expensive cedar, the silence between them no longer combative, but thick with an exhausting shared vulnerability that neither of them knew how to navigate. Julian stripped off his ruined, rain-soaked tie and poured a generous measure of scotch from the minibar, his movements stiff and mechanical as he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the violently churning Puget Sound. When I was 19, my father discovered a similar embezzlement scheme orchestrated by his own brother Richard. But instead of prosecuting him, my father chose to protect the family name, a decision that ultimately drove him to an early grave, Julian confessed, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to tear from his throat. Evelyn stood frozen near the edge of the bed, the sudden, raw confession completely disarming her own carefully constructed defenses. Realizing that his extreme, emotionless philosophy of stoic investing wasn't just a corporate brand, it was a desperate survival mechanism. I swore I would never let human sentiment cloud my judgment or compromise my empire, but my uncle is perfectly willing to burn down the entire legacy just to sit on the ashes. He continued, taking a slow, burning swallow of the amber liquid. You aren't your father, Julian, and you aren't fighting this battle alone anymore. Evelyn murmured the fiercely independent underdog logic that had driven her entire life, suddenly demanding that she step across the invisible boundary they had drawn. She walked slowly toward him, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, entirely abandoning the guarded, calculating persona she utilized to hide her own deep-seated fears of failure and her secret, simmering thirst for vengeance. I have spent years fighting tooth and nail just to keep my father's small company from drowning in the wake of corporate giants, constantly terrified that if I showed a single moment of weakness, I would lose everything, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly as she stood mere inches from his towering frame. Julian turned his head, his piercing green eyes locking onto hers, the heavy storm-filtered light illuminating the stark exhaustion and the beautiful, undeniable truth shining in her gaze. They were two fiercely ambitious, deeply wounded people who had built impenetrable fortresses around their hearts, both absolutely terrified of surrendering control, yet undeniably magnetized by the profound mutual understanding that they were exactly the same. He reached out his large, warm hand, gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing away a stray drop of rainwater from her cheek. The sheer tenderness of the gesture sending a devastating electric shock straight to her core. The air in the hotel suite grew suffocatingly thick, the relentless pounding of the rain against the glass perfectly mirroring the chaotic, deafening rhythm of their racing hearts. As the last of their contractual boundaries dissolved, "We are supposed to be business partners, Evelyn, completely equal, entirely rational, and strictly bound by the terms of our 50-50 clause," Julian whispered, his voice a ragged, desperate plea as his gaze dropped to the soft, parted curve of her lips. "I don't feel very rational right now, Julian," she breathed, her hands instinctively coming up to rest against the solid, muscular plane of his chest, feeling the frantic, hammering heartbeat that completely betrayed his stoic exterior. With a low, guttural groan that sounded like a man finally yielding after a lifetime of war, Julian crushed his mouth to hers, completely obliterating the careful, negotiated distance they had sworn to maintain. The kiss was a violent, passionate collision of raw need and desperate relief, a torrential release of all the suppressed tension, the boardroom battles, and the profound, terrifying realization that they were falling irrevocably in love. Evelyn melted against him, her fingers tangling frantically in his damp hair, kissing him back with a fierce, consuming hunger that stripped away her secret vendettas and left only the staggering, undeniable truth of the present moment. Julian's arms wrapped around her waist like bands of steel, lifting her slightly off the floor as he backed her against the heavy glass window, the cool surface a stark contrast to the blazing, consuming heat radiating between them. He kissed her with a possessive, breathtaking intensity that systematically dismantled his entire philosophy of emotional detachment, claiming her not as a strategic asset or a contractual proxy, but as the absolute, irreplaceable center of his world. Every touch, every desperate slide of his lips against her skin was a silent confession of the vulnerability he had hidden for years, a desperate attempt to anchor himself to the only real thing in a life built on calculated illusions. Evelyn clung to his broad shoulders, a soft, breathless gasp escaping her throat as his kisses trailed down her jawline, completely surrendering her fierce, independent control to the overwhelming, intoxicating power of their shared desire. She had entered this marriage planning to execute a flawless, cold-blooded revenge for her family's ruined retail legacy. But wrapped in Julian's arms, tasting the rain and the scotch and the desperate honesty on his lips, her vengeance felt entirely meaningless. The 50-50 clause, designed to maintain a perfect balance of power and prevent emotional liability, had just been spectacularly, irreversibly breached, throwing them both into uncharted, perilous territory, where the stakes were no longer just corporate shares, but their own fiercely protected hearts. When they finally reluctantly pulled apart, their breathing was ragged, the heavy silence of the dimly lit hotel suite broken only by the steady, unrelenting drumming of the Seattle storm against the reinforced glass. Julian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed tightly as he fought to regulate his fractured breathing, his hands still gripping her waist, as if he were absolutely terrified she might suddenly disappear into the rain. "If we do this, if we cross this line, there is no going back to the safety of the boardroom or the predictability of our contract," he warned, his voice a low, ragged whisper that vibrated deeply in the quiet room. Evelyn opened her eyes, looking up into the handsome, tormented face of the man she was supposed to destroy, realizing with a sudden, beautiful clarity that she was perfectly willing to burn her own plans to the ground to save him. "I stopped wanting to be safe the moment I met you, Julian," she answered softly, her hands sliding up to cup his face, silencing his fears and completely embracing the terrifying, chaotic vulnerability of their new reality. But even as he pulled her back into a deep, claiming kiss, the damning digital evidence of Richard's sabotage lay glowing on the laptop across the room, a silent ticking reminder that while they may have surrendered to each other, the brutal war for their empire was far from over. The morning sun over Manhattan was blindingly indifferent, casting long, sharp shadows across the boardroom of stoic investing, where the air felt thick enough to suffocate even the most seasoned executive. Julian stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of impenetrable granite, watching as his uncle Richard orchestrated the final act of a coup that had been decades in the making. Richard didn't bother with pleasantries, sliding a thin encrypted tablet across the obsidian surface to the assembled board members, his eyes gleaming with the predatory triumph of a man who had finally trapped his prey. "The evidence is indisputable," Richard announced, his voice smooth, echoing with the false weight of moral indignation. "We have traced the internal security breach at our Seattle facility, not to an outside saboteur, but to an administrative override executed from the private terminal of a non-executive associate, the very person Julian so foolishly and unprofessionally empowered yesterday." He turned his gaze toward Evelyn, who sat motionless, her posture perfectly regal, her eyes scanning the room with the calm detachment of a seasoned player who had anticipated this trap all along. "The board members are here to vote on the immediate termination of Julian's CEO contract, citing gross negligence and the permanent expulsion of his spouse from all corporate affairs effective immediately," Richard declared, his smirk widening as he anticipated the final crushing blow. Julian's hand remained steady, though he could feel the cold, sharp reality of the betrayal settling in his veins, knowing that Richard had successfully manipulated the evidence to frame Evelyn as the mastermind behind the warehouse sabotage. He glanced at Evelyn, expecting to see fear or perhaps the frantic panic of a woman caught in a snare she hadn't foreseen, but instead he found her looking directly at him with a calm, almost serene confidence that defied the catastrophic situation. "Richard, your performance is as tedious as your strategy, but you've made one critical error in your calculation," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the hushed room like a razor blade. She pulled a slim silver flash drive from her pocket, her movements precise and deliberate as she stood and walked to the primary projection unit, the silence in the room becoming so absolute it was painful. "You assumed that because I was new to this empire, I wouldn't know exactly where the bodies were buried." She continued plugging the drive in. "While you were busy framing me for the Seattle crash, you left a digital breadcrumb trail connecting your personal offshore accounts to the very shell company that paid the saboteur." The screen flared to life, projecting a cascading sequence of encrypted financial transfers and direct communication logs between Richard's private server and the mercenary who had tampered with the warehouse supports. The boardroom erupted into chaotic shouting, the investors and board members scrambling to process the shattering evidence as Richard's face turned a violent, sickly shade of gray, his arrogance disintegrating into pure, unadulterated terror. "This is a fabrication, a malicious digital forgery," Richard roared, lunging toward the console in a desperate, pathetic attempt to shut the screen. But two security personnel, acting on Julian's silent signal, stepped forward to firmly restrain him. Julian didn't look at his uncle. His entire focus was on Evelyn, whose brilliance and cold-blooded foresight had not only neutralized the threat, but had effectively handed him the victory on a silver platter. The vote is irrelevant, Richard, because as of this moment, you are no longer a stakeholder in stoic investing. Julian announced, his voice low, lethal, and absolute. The CEO mask he had spent a lifetime perfecting, finally feeling like a natural, powerful extension of himself. The legal department has been authorized to initiate criminal proceedings for industrial sabotage, embezzlement, and attempted corporate espionage, which will ensure you spend the rest of your life answering to a jury rather than a board of directors. Richard was dragged out of the room, his incoherent shouting fading into the distance, leaving behind an atmosphere that had transformed from a scene of execution into a theater of utter, breathtaking dominance. The moment the doors locked and the remaining board members retreated, the sudden, deafening silence of the executive floor hit them like a physical weight. Julian leaned heavily against the mahogany table, his breathing erratic, the adrenaline of the narrow victory finally beginning to ebb and leave him feeling hollow and profoundly shaken. He looked up, his gaze finding Evelyn standing by the window, her silhouette rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "You let him think he had won until the very last second," he said, his voice raw, an uncharacteristic tremor of pure awe-struck respect vibrating in his tone. "I needed to see his full hand, Julian, because I knew he couldn't resist a public victory. And a public victory is the only place a man like that truly loses," she replied, her voice steady, but she refused to turn around, her shoulders hunching slightly under the immense, crushing weight of the confrontation. Julian walked toward her, the space between them filled with the charged, heavy silence of two people who had just survived a war, but were now forced to face the dangerous, unpredictable landscape of their own complicated reality. He reached out, stopping just behind her, his hands hovering in the air for a heartbeat before he settled them gently on her shoulders. The contact, a fragile, tentative bridge between their two fortresses. "You risked everything to save my name, my empire, and my reputation, despite the fact that I spent the last few weeks treating you like a tactical liability," he whispered, his voice thick with a profound, soul-deep remorse that made her chest ache. Evelyn turned in his arms, her eyes searching his for any trace of the cold, stoic CEO, but finding only a man who was deeply, profoundly wounded by the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. "We are partners, Julian, and partners don't walk into a slaughterhouse alone," she said, her voice soft, her resolve beginning to melt under the intensity of his gaze. Julian pulled her flush against him, his hands tangling in her hair as he buried his face in the crook of her neck, his body trembling with the aftershock of the day's brutal revelations. "I pushed you away because I was terrified that if I let you in, if I let myself need you, it would be the one weakness that would destroy me," he confessed, his words muffled against her skin, the raw admission of his greatest fear tearing through the final stubborn layers of his emotional defense. Evelyn held him tightly, her own heart hammering in sync with his, realizing that the revenge she had originally planned was now entirely irrelevant. The only thing she wanted was to hold him in the eye of this storm. The 50-50 clause was no longer a contractual boundary for power, but a terrifyingly intimate agreement that had forced them to acknowledge that they were the only two people in the world who truly understood the cost of the fortresses they had built to survive. The morning after the fall of the Sterling Empire, the Manhattan skyline was washed in an unusually gentle golden light that seemed to soften the harsh edges of the glass towers, mirroring the unprecedented stillness inside Julian's penthouse. Evelyn stood on the private terrace, watching the city wake up, not as a woman who had just engaged in a brutal boardroom war, but as someone who had finally stepped out from behind the heavy, suffocating shadow of her own past. The 50-50 clause, the cold transactional instrument that had brought them together to fight their respective demons, felt like an artifact from a different, colder lifetime. Julian appeared behind her, the familiar silhouette of the man she had learned to respect, admire, and ultimately love. His movements no longer rigid with the weight of defensive stoicism, but flowing with a newfound quiet grace. He didn't speak, but his presence was a warm, anchoring force, his hands resting gently on her waist as he pulled her back against his chest. A gesture of ownership that was no longer about power, but about belonging. The air was filled with the promise of a future they would now define on their own terms, free from the calculated equations and the cold protective walls they had meticulously built to keep the world at bay. I looked through the archives of my father's firm last night. The documents you recovered from Richard's server were the final pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for years, Evelyn said, her voice soft, the heavy burden of her secret vendetta finally dissolving into the crisp morning air. She turned in his arms, her eyes searching his for any trace of the cold, detached CEO who had once treated their marriage as a mere business merger, but found only the man who had fought for her in the rain and stood by her in the fire. I didn't come here to win a war for stoic investing, Julian. I came here to prove that my family's legacy wasn't just a casualty in your empire's rise. She admitted the raw honesty of her confession, leaving them both entirely exposed in the intimate, fragile silence of the penthouse. Julian pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, as he whispered a vow that was far more binding than any corporate contract. His voice thick with an emotion he no longer made any attempt to contain. Your family's legacy is now a permanent part of this company, not as a hostile takeover, but as a foundational pillar, and the only thing I have ever wanted to acquire, Evelyn, was your heart. The vulnerability in his admission was a stunning, beautiful transformation. The man who had once viewed love as a liability, now acknowledging it as the absolute transformative center of his life. Julian didn't reach for a tablet or a ledger. Instead, he pulled a small velvet box from the pocket of his robe and opened it, revealing not a strategic asset or a corporate token, but a classic, timeless diamond ring that shimmered with the brilliance of 1,000 honest promises. Our first agreement had an impossible clause that was designed to protect us from each other. But I want to make a new one, a permanent one, with no conditions, no expiration, and no exit strategies, he stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that filled the vast room with light. Evelyn stared at the ring, then up at his face, seeing the man who had finally learned that true strength was not found in control, but in the terrifying, beautiful willingness to be vulnerable with the person he loved. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face as she laughed a sound that finally felt like the true start of her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with a happiness so profound it felt like it could lift them both above the clouds. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, the simple, perfect fit, sealing the final, most important merger of their lives. And as he pulled her into a deep, claiming kiss, they both knew that the best rules were indeed the ones that were broken by love. The wedding, held months later on a secluded, sun-drenched estate overlooking the Pacific, was a beautiful, intimate affair, attended only by the people who truly mattered and understood the brutal, hard-won journey they had traveled to find each other. Evelyn's father, his health restored by the stability and new resources, sat in the front row, weeping openly, his pride in his daughter, a tangible force that warmed the entire garden. Eleanor, ever the formidable presence, sat beside him, watching her son with a rare, genuine smile, having finally realized that the man he had become was infinitely better than the cold machine she had once pushed him to be. As Evelyn walked down the aisle, the golden light catching the silk of her gown, she only had eyes for Julian, who stood waiting for her, not as the untouchable billionaire CEO, but as a man who had finally, beautifully, returned to his true self. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes about hostile takeovers and the brutal reality of their first boardroom clash, a testament to the fact that they hadn't just survived their challenges, they had evolved because of them. Later, at the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the happy guests, Julian pulled her away for a quiet moment by the ocean. The rhythmic sound of the waves, a peaceful counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I have something for you," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye, as he reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the original 50-50 contract, now crumpled and entirely obsolete. "Our final, official, completely illegal amendment," he said, handing it to her, his voice full of a love so deep it was bottomless. She unfolded the paper and with a pen he produced from his pocket, crossed out the 50% clause and replaced it with a single permanent word: together. "Binding for a lifetime," she said, her voice ringing with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had finally found her home, not in a fortress, but in the heart of the person standing beside her. He took the paper from her, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his pocket, close to his heart, before pulling her into his arms for a slow, sweet kiss that held all the promises of their future. Their story had started with a cold, calculated ultimatum in a dark room, a game of pretend with impossible rules. But it had ended here, with a truth they had fought, bled, and ultimately surrendered for. It was a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the strongest contracts are the ones that are written in the ink of unconditional love, and that the best rules are the ones that are broken together to build something lasting.